Hello, and welcome to another episode of Growing for Wholesale Standards. For today's episode, we're going to discuss the USDA grading specifications for cucumbers. These look great. However, if you're growing for wholesale markets, these cucumbers would all be a USDA number 2. When you're selling to wholesale markets, what you're selling them is uniformity and consistency. And for cucumbers, what we're seeing here, that just does not exist. The dollar bill is 6 inches, establishing a length, and we can see that they vary in length, as well as beyond the visual damage on some of these. You can see how others taper off at the end, so it isn't quite creating that cucumber shape that you see when the cucumber is fully mature. To explain this a little bit more, let's hear from Adam Watson from Appalachian Harvest. He helps growers. So he's just going to discuss some tips and some more information about grading and growing cucumbers.
Minimum length for cucumbers is typically 6 inches, but they also have to take into account the girth of the cucumber. So sometimes you can have one that is 6 inches, but it doesn't quite have enough girth to it. It's just too small. So it's a combination both of length and girth. Lots of times we like to see them longer than 6. And sometimes what happens is you may have one that just meets the standard, but it's hard to find a box where it looks right. So if you have a scenario where everything in the box is 7 inches, 7.5 inches, and then you put one that's 6 1/4, it looks small. It doesn't look like it fits. And because we're trying to find uniform pack outs, it is important, and sometimes you will see a smaller one not make it into a box. Same reason, maybe if you have a really nice long one, if it's significantly longer than a lot of the other ones, it may not look right in the box. So you do have to pay attention to what box cucumbers or other fruit go in, because you're wanting to have a uniform box appearance.
So before I get into the exact USDA grading specifications for cucumbers, I usually like to share some helpful tips, tricks, and reminders. That is now its own separate video, so if you do want a little refresher, click that below in the description. Alrighty, so let's talk about the US grading specifications for cucumbers. Unlike other fruits and vegetables, where we usually see just a number 1, a number 2, and then when I tell you to throw in the compost, cucumbers have a lot of different grades for number 1. Here we have a US Fancy, a US Extra number 1, a US number 1, a US number 1 Small, and a US number 1 Large. Okay, so I just want to take a couple of minutes and just kind of break down some of these different grades that the USDA outlines for what would be considered a number 1. I'm going to start with what I showed third, a US number 1. That consists of cucumbers which are fairly well colored, they're fairly well formed, they're not overgrown, they're fresh, they're firm, they're free from decay, sun-scalded, and from damage caused by scars, yellowing, sunburn, dirt, or other foreign materials, free from damage caused by freezing, free from damage caused by disease, insects, cuts, bruises, mechanical, or any other means. They should not be more than 2 to 3/8 of an inch, and it should not be less than 6 inches. We saw that with the dollar bill. I'm going to jump up to the very top now. Grade above that would just be your US Fancy. So the US Fancy are cucumbers that are well colored, well formed, and that's different from what we saw as a US number 1, which said fairly well colored, fairly well formed. So the US Fancy is truly your fanciest, your most beautiful, your cream of the crop cucumber. Whereas the US number 1, like we're talking about for a lot of other grades, this is your nearly perfect cucumber. So just keep that in mind. Now a US Extra number 1, which is the second grade I showed you, that is actually a combination of half fancy and half number 1s. So keep that in mind. If you're growing for fancy, or maybe you're growing for number 1, you could potentially be hitting 3 different grades to sell to your wholesale buyer. Either a case full of fancy, a case full of number 1s, or the US Extra number 1, which is half fancy, half number 1s. The fourth grade I showed you guys was a US number 1 Small. Now this still meets all the requirements of a US number 1 grade, but it changes in the length and the width requirement. So in the diameter, the width requirements, it should not be less than 1 1/2 inches or more than 2 inches. And there are no length requirements. For the very last one I showed you, a US number 1 Large, same deal. That needs to be hitting everything as a US number 1. It just should not be less than 6 inches in length. For today's video, I'm just going to show you guys some US number 1s, and really, when you're deciding to grow cucumbers, discuss with your marketer, what grade should you be going for? what grades should you be trying to be going for? Maybe it's easier to just try and hit small and maybe larger number ones and not have to worry about the US fancy or the US extra number one, half fancy, half number one. For the purposes of this video, like I said, we're just going to go over what would make a US number one, which hits a lot of these different criterias. So as you can see here, a US number one, it should not be more than 2 to 3 inches in diameter, and the length should not be less than 6 inches. It's fairly well colored, fairly well formed. It's fresh, it's firm, it's free from decay, from sun scald, from damage caused by scars. There's no yellowing, there's no sunburns, there's no dirt damage, there's no disease damage, there's no insect damage or cuts or bruises. Here you can see a cucumber that was grown as a US number one, but it doesn't quite meet the size requirements and ended up getting graded as a US number one, small. So keep that in mind. You could be growing for a certain particular type of grade. Cucumbers have so many different types of grades that you may slide into another US number one grade before it just slides into a number two. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a good idea of what kind of standards you'd be growing for when growing for a US number one, whether US fancy, US extra, US number one small, US number one large. So what would make it a US number two?
This one, good quality on that end of the cucumber, but if you turn around to this end, you suddenly start to see you have lack of fill out, so it's not a uniform taper over the whole fruit. Still be fine to eat, but it's just simply not a number one fruit. Some of the more obviously defects are scarring due to either insect damage or sometimes just handling in the field. This is another good example of one that's not uniform in taper, so you have a reduction in size on the stem end, not acceptable. It's not a cull because it's still a sound fruit. There's no leaking, there's no open gaping wounds. This is something that can sit in a cooler, and like for us, whenever we send it out to food bank, it's still going to be a sound item of produce, but it's not one that's going to meet the cosmetics. So it's ugly from the standpoint of damage, but it's still a sound fruit. There's no open wounds, it's not going to rot quickly, and that's why it can still be a number two rather than a cull. You've got a significant wound on there, but it's not leaking, it's scabbed over, it's not draining anything. That would still be probably acceptable for food bank because it's probably not going to melt down while we're sending it to food bank. But if that was fresh, if that was new, that'd probably be one I'd ship to the coal pile, toss it, simply because I'd be afraid it wouldn't last. But where that's starting to heal over, the fruit's closing itself, you can probably let this stay in a number two. And so here's one where it's probably graded to a number two because of the color difference. It's good quality, decent size. You'd like it to be a little bit bigger, but it's also a scenario where if these are left on the plant, they can end up sizing up even larger round and still not gain length sometimes. So sometimes it's an issue of the proportionality of the fruit.
Alrighty, so let's test your knowledge. We talked a lot about what the generic terms, what a number one would be, what we would be considering a number two. Now I'm going to throw up some pictures. Take your best guess. What do you think it should be thrown into a number one pile or a number two pile? So that last one, that should go to your compost. That's what happens when the cucumber beetle can get a hold of your crop and it will just ravage your product. Remember, you have a ton of input you can use, but the label is a law. So any integrated pest management system you're using, any sprays, any input you're going to use on your crop to combat the cucumber beetle, make sure that it has been approved by your aggregator/distributor or your wholesale buyer. Scout weekly. You're looking for early signs of the cucumber beetle so you can preemptively spray to keep them off of your crops. Also, don't forget to carry any disease guides, pest guides, and beneficial insect guides. The pest guide will really help you identify any cucumber beetle eggs or anything like that. Okay, so once you have everything laid out, it's been washed, it's been graded, now it's time to box your product. Number ones are going to wholesale buyers, so uniformity, presentation, that is key. Number twos are going to your food banks and your wholesale buyers, so still place it nicely in the box. It's just not as important as a number one box. Most buyers have a weight or a product count, so just make sure that you're hitting whatever that is, and after that, apply your labels. Now, I'm not going to throw in the little section about which labels to apply and what they are for. If you need a refresher, check out that video. It is in the description below, and it's just a couple of minutes to talk about which labels you need to apply on the outside of your box as well as what needs to go on inside. Well, that's everything for grading cucumbers. Hopefully that helped. Any questions you guys have, throw it in the comments. We'll get back to you, and I hope to see you next time on Growing for Wholesale Standards.